Why, hello to all my viewers who have stumbled upon this video. Today's book review, unfortunately, again, is not a Puritan paperback, but I think it is one that's very relevant. So today's book review will be on A Christian's Guide to Mental Illness. And there it says answers to 30 common questions. So there are 30 chapters. Each of them have a question that they answer. And perhaps I should go over the chapters first. So here you can see an overview of the chapters. They are relatively short, actually. So each chapter is about around 8 pages, roughly there. So it's actually quite a nice short read. You can see some of these chapters here. What is mental illness first and all? How does it affect, both the person who struggles with it and those around them? And then what causes it? Can Christians get mental illness? What can pastors and church communities do? And then here, what role does health professionals and medication and then biblical counselors, people who are a little bit more specialized, what is their role? And then what are ways that you can help, just as someone who knows the person who is struggling with mental health? And other practical helps as well: scripture, prayer, sacraments, ordinary means of grace. What are some challenges? How do you sort of bear with them? And how about the caregivers? How do you avoid getting caregivers burned out as well? So this book, it's about 236 or so pages. They do give a little story at the end about the motivation behind writing this book. So here, I found it was a very good introductory book. So it does accomplish what the title has said: The Christian's Guide to Mental Illness. And at the very beginning, they do explain, what is mental illness, because the label itself is such a broad category. So they sort of talk about how it can refer to almost too many things, but then if you don't have a label, how do you even refer to it? So their analogy was like a sports car. If I say a sports car, you might think of different types of sports cars. I don't actually know types of sports cars, but there's different brands, different models. But that label in itself is helpful, at least to get your mind in that area. At least you're not thinking about like buses or trains or something else. And then what I really appreciate about this book was it was actually a very balanced view. So I'll talk a little bit more about my own personal thoughts with mental illness, but it was a very balanced view on what is mental illness, how does it affect the person, and then what you find with Christians and mental health is that sometimes you swing into either extremes, right? Sometimes there's the extreme of let's treat it like just from a purely secular and clinical point of view. There's no need to involve like any kind of spiritual aspect to it. Whereas the other extreme is just it's all spiritual. It can all be overcome by Bible reading, prayer, confessing sin. Like it's purely like basically a sin problem. So here they've hit like a healthy balance. And one of the authors, David Murray, he also explains how he used to be on that more extreme of mental health is purely like a spiritual problem. But over the years and in his role as a counselor, he's sort of come more into the middle of, yes, like there are things that are caused by sin, but there are other things that may not be a direct result of sin, but the result of living in a fallen world. So I think it was helpful to define it, first of all. What is mental illness? What are some of the causes? So they sort of outline, there is sometimes, yes, personal sin. There's living in a fallen world, and sometimes just being sinned against. That can also be a cause for depression, for mental illness. And they do have a lot of good analogies that they use throughout the book. So they talked about how living in a fallen world, there are parts that just get damaged in you. So similarly to like any physical kind of illness, like if you have cancer, your particular organ or area is just a damaged area. But likewise with our minds, living in a fallen and sinful world, that can also happen to our minds. So it's really bridging that sort of connection between physical things we often treat with like medicine and other necessary methods of treatment, But how about mental illness? How do we treat mental illness? Why do we sort of view it differently? And should we even? And perhaps the chapter that I really did quite appreciate was chapter 16, because I think it's a big question for a lot of people. What is the role of medication? Because there you have some people who do say, medication should not be used at all. And then others are often maybe too prone to recommending medication right away. So here, if I can read, and I've put it up on screen, our culture is suffering from an overprescription of medications, with meds for mental illness being some of the most overused. This is partly because of today's instant cure culture. We are not willing to suffer. Let me go to the next page for you. We are not willing to suffer anything for even a brief time without seeking some alleviation of the pain and discomfort by means of medication. This is especially true when it comes to sadness, anxiety, confusion, and other emotional and mental challenges. If there's a pill, we take it and ask no further questions. There's no attempts made to address other physical or spiritual issues. There's no seeking of God's help, grace, and counsel. Just give me something to make me feel better. One of the results of this rush to medications is that people miss out on the opportunity for spiritual healing and spiritual growth from affliction. We medicate away guilt, shame, fear, and confusion without asking deeper questions. We want quick healing and therefore short-circuit the spiritual fruit that grows only in the soil of patience in suffering. There's also a little weighing of the potential side effects of medication. So there they do recognize that in a day and age like this, people are prone to just trying to remove it instantly. The moment any pain or discomfort comes up, medicate it away. There is a reaction like that. But at the same time, they don't advocate totally against, abstaining from medication altogether. So their insights, they say, when it comes to medications, number one, we don't run to them first. But then number two, we don't rule them out altogether. And three, we don't rely on them alone. So I did appreciate that that they did have a very holistic approach. So of course, there are some more extreme cases of mental health where it would be good to have some sort of medication so that the person is at least in touch with reality. They're not just, totally disconnected or unable to function, but they're brought back to a place where they are able to function and to face the problem. But at the same time, we don't rush to it. Like for a minor problem, it'd be unwise to just jump straight to medication and removing the symptoms entirely. Lloyd Jones would always talk about how removing the symptoms, that's the worst thing a doctor could do. But you have to have the symptoms there. That way you're able to at least find out what is the root cause. And then you're better able to treat it. But if you remove the symptoms, then you really have no clue what they're suffering with. And then their third point here, we don't rely on medications alone. So throughout the rest of the book, they do talk about the goodness of, being surrounded by community, the need for corporate worship, being involved in church, being cared for, and serving as well. So medications, they're a helpful part, and they should be used in conjunction with everything else. And that was, I think, the theme of the book that I saw. So there are a lot of practical helps, like, if you know someone with mental health, what are some ways to, or mental illness, I should say. If you know someone with mental illness, what are some ways that you are able to help and to care for them? And they give a lot of practical advice, which I find is very helpful for a book that says it's a guide. And they are fair, because I think oftentimes they make this little distinction early on that, you're not just, I'm, like if someone has depression, they shouldn't say I'm depressed, because then that would identify them with the problem. Like, I am X, I am this problem, I am the problem, basically. But it's a little bit more helpful to say, I have this problem. I have depression, I have anxiety. And then once you frame it that way, then it's not what you are, but it's something that you're able to deal with, right? If you have a problem, you're able to deal with the problem. So they do recommend, doing the standard things, really. Going to church, worshiping with others, being encouraged by others. And they recommend that you walk alongside people who have mental illness. But for those who do have mental illness, they even recommend, some of the good basic stuff. Pray with others, but even basic things like, exercise, sleep, and your diet, make sure that those basic things are taken care of, because your physical condition does affect your spiritual condition. So I'm not quite sure if they actually mentioned it in this book here, but it's like with Christians in psychology, there is this idea of like embodied souls. So every human is an embodied soul. We have a physical body and we have a soul, and our souls are in this body. So it does make sense that the physical can affect the spiritual, and vice versa. How you're doing spiritually can also affect you physically. And Murray, he does have some other book on the Puritans, how they saw mental illness, how there were some things that were more physically caused. There are some physical explanations for why someone might be depressed. If they have a poor diet, they're not sleeping properly, then it's no surprise, right, that they might be depressed. But there are also spiritual causes, and that's not something they shy away from in this book. Sometimes you might be depressed or anxious because of sin. Not in every single case, but it can be, and then it shouldn't be something that you toss aside. So I found it was a very helpful book. I've taken a few counseling courses through my school, but this was a good read, because it's a basic guide, right? It gives you some very practical advice of how do you do this. And then they also share little stories at the end of every chapter of how the authors David Murray, Tom Karel Jr., of how they personally struggled with mental health, or someone that they knew. But they do talk about their own personal struggles too. So it's not just, all textbook and theory, but they've gone through it themselves. They're able to speak from experience. And I think as someone who's a little bit less involved with people who do have mental illness, that's probably one of the most helpful things that I think is, for me, like looking into, how I might serve someone with mental illness later on. What have others done who are far more experienced and qualified than I am to counsel? What have they done? And I think that's always what I've appreciated the most from even my counseling course. What has this person done? This person who counsels for a living, what have they seen and what have they done? That's always been the most helpful thing. So this book, it does take a lot of practical advice, and yeah, it's gives you a good base to start with. So I do recommend it. I just wish they shared a little bit more, actually. So these chapters, they are a little bit short, but I wish there was a little bit more personal stories of even just what they did. Maybe in some other books, maybe that's where I should have went. I'm looking just for more stories, and maybe. But for a guide to mental illness, a Christian's guide to mental illness, this book has done what it's set out to do. Perhaps on a more personal note, what do I think of mental illness? And I think before I was probably the same as David Murray, where I did feel like the term was just so broad, right? Like mental illness, it could cover so much. There's certainly some things that, people struggle with. Prevalence of social media, I'm sure social media contributes greatly to a lower quality of mental health. But I think I was similar to David Murray in the sense that I thought before, you probably could just pray and read your Bible, and then your depression, anxiety, that stuff would go away. But I think as I get older, I am thinking a little bit more about some of those more extreme cases, and even like just the causes, like being sinned against. Like I think there is some validity to, it is a more complicated issue. It's not as simple as what I used to think it was. And it would be unfair for me to simplify it that much, especially when I don't know many people who struggle with mental illness. And I think for myself, I was doing some reflecting too, just over the past years. I don't know if I could say I'm mildly depressed, but I do just wake up, at least according to the list of symptoms for depression. I do wake up and I just oftentimes do not want to get out of bed. The times I do, it's usually to avoid a crowd. Like I'll catch a train early just so I'll wake up an extra hour early just so I can, miss the crowds. Something like that. But outside of catching a train, most days I sleep, I wake up not feeling refreshed, and not a whole lot of motivation for each day. And it's been like this for years. So not that it's totally debilitating where I cannot do anything, but at the same time, I don't feel like I've been as productive as I could have been. So I think striking a balance is always the harder part, right? So as a Christian, someone who's of an Asian background, mental health is a bit less talked about, but I think it's good to be balanced in how I approach it. Before I would have been far too black and white and just said, okay, just pray, just get right with God. But having gotten older, I think issues are a little bit more complex than I would have thought. And a big part that they emphasize here in this book is patience. You patiently walk with someone who's struggling with mental illness, and the path to recovery it's not just a straight line that goes, every day they're just better. But they say, it's a bit of a squiggly line, like they're up, days that they're up, days that they're down. There are days where they just seem hopeless, like they're beyond hope. But ultimately, hope is always in the Lord. So they made a good point about God's grace. Those things are necessary. Do the things that you need to do. Do what God has said, right? There are some basic things: reading the Bible, prayer, fellowshipping with His people, being encouraged by His people. Those are basic things that you should do first. And then also have the additional helps. Have some friends who can walk alongside you, encourage you, pray with you, even when you're feeling at your lowest. Do those things as well. So it is more of a holistic approach. I did really like that. As for myself, perhaps they're talking about even for themselves. When they first encountered their own battle with mental illness, there is this, reaction to almost like be in denial or to just rationalize it. That's not such a big deal. So I think it is good to do some self-examination and think, is there some sort of like cause that I haven't thought about? And then is there something that I should be doing? Because they do emphasize here that, the person who is suffering with mental illness, they shouldn't just be exempt from everything. They should try to serve however they can, in small capacities. Every human is made to work and to serve, and there is great blessing in serving others. They use this analogy of, someone who's sick, but, they take care of like their child, so they get up, they might be groggier and sick, but, serving someone else that gives them energy and strength for the day. So likewise, for those who are struggling with mental illness, it's also good for them to serve others and to serve those around them. So that is just a little picture. They do recommend, reading over the book, kind of like just get a good overview of, 30 questions, and then going a little bit more specifically into the specific questions of, what are some of these things that maybe I need to more focus on. So I found that first part was a great base, and then the question of, what causes mental illness, and can Christians have mental illness? How about church and family? What can they do? That was helpful, because I think if you don't have mental illness, then you're probably someone who might have to support someone who does have mental illness, whether it be family or in a church community. And then this last part was really just looking to the Lord, similar to how the Puritans would really say, during a time of affliction, you trust in the Lord that He will do His purposes. God, He's still sovereign. God can bring good out of affliction, out of suffering, out of even mental illness. God is able to use that to further sanctify His people and better equip them to serve others and to bear witness to God's greatness, God's grace. God's grace is made perfect in our weakness. So that's my review for the book. It's a pretty quick read. I think if you really sat down and read it, you can finish it right away. And very relevant topic for our day. So highly recommend it. It is available. If you're a Canadian, Reformed Book Services has it. So I do recommend it. And hopefully this has been helpful for you as well. So see you in the next video. Thanks again for watching.